Something changed on California's earthquake map this year, and most people still have no idea what it actually means. This is not a repackaged headline. This is not fear-mongering dressed up as news. Scientists uncovered a physical connection point buried underneath Southern California that links two of the state's most dangerous faults together, and at the same time, the stress sitting inside that system has climbed to a level not seen in roughly 1,000 years. Both of those facts come from real peer-reviewed research, not speculation, not a viral rumor, and not a clickbait exaggeration. Today we are going to walk through exactly what was found, what it means for the millions of people living on top of it, and whether the big one is actually getting closer, using the real science instead of the noise. If you live in California or anywhere near a major fault line, drop a comment and tell me where. I want to know whether this is the first time you're hearing about this particular study, because for a lot of people, it is. And if you want to keep up with stories like this as new research comes out, go ahead and subscribe. It doesn't cost anything, and it genuinely helps this reach people who need to see it. Let's start with the science itself, because this deserves to be treated seriously rather than sensationally. Earlier this year, a team of researchers led by a geophysicist at the University of Bergen published a detailed study in the Journal of Geophysical Research, Solid Earth. The team pulled in scientists from Northern Arizona University, the United States Geological Survey, and the University of California, San Diego. Their conclusion was stark. The San Andreas Fault system in Southern California is now under more stress than at any point in the last 1,000 years. To understand what that sentence actually means, you have to understand how earthquakes work at a basic level. The Pacific Plate and the North American Plate are constantly trying to slide past one another. Near the surface, friction locks them in place. So instead of gliding smoothly, the rock bends and absorbs energy instead of releasing it. That stored energy is what geologists call stress, and it accumulates for years, decades, sometimes centuries, until the rock simply cannot hold any more of it. When that threshold is crossed, the fault suddenly slips, and everything that was stored gets released at once, as an earthquake. The longer a section of fault goes without slipping, the more energy piles up, and the larger the eventual release tends to be. The southern stretch of the San Andreas Fault last ruptured in a major way back in 1857 in what's known as the Fort Tejon earthquake, estimated at roughly magnitude 7.9. That was 169 years ago. For nearly 17 decades, the Pacific and North American plates have continued grinding past one another at about 5 centimeters a year without a major release along that segment. To put that time span into perspective, California had only been a state for about 7 years when that fault last let go, and Los Angeles was a fraction of the size it is now. The city that currently sits on top of this fault system, with its skyscrapers, its freeways, its hospitals, and its millions of residents, essentially did not exist in anything close to its modern form the last time this ground truly ruptured. All of that unreleased motion has to go somewhere, and according to this new research, it has gone directly into the rock as stored stress. The researchers didn't simply eyeball old records to reach this conclusion. They built a physics-based, four-dimensional computer model that simulated an entire 1,000 years of earthquake history along both the San Andreas Fault and the neighboring San Jacinto Fault. They fed that model radiocarbon-dated sediment samples, tree ring records documenting past ground ruptures, and written historical observations going back centuries. Then, they ran the simulation forward to the present day to calculate how much stress has actually built up right now. The result was unambiguous. Stress on multiple fault segments is currently at or above the highest levels recorded anywhere in that entire 1,000-year simulation. Not approaching a critical threshold, according to the model, already past it. Now, here's the part that genuinely changed the map itself. The San Andreas Fault and the San Jacinto Fault meet at a location called Cajun Pass, roughly 50 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles. Before this study, most models treated these as two separate systems, each one capable of producing its own independent earthquake. What the research team found was different. Cajun Pass can act as what they're calling an earthquake gate. Under the right conditions, a rupture that starts on the San Andreas Fault can travel straight through that junction and jump onto the San Jacinto Fault. To picture why that matters, it helps to think of a fault system less like one continuous crack in the ground and more like a chain of separate segments, each one capable of slipping somewhat independently. Older earthquake models often treated each of those segments in isolation, calculating the maximum size an earthquake could reach if only that one section ruptured. Cajun Pass complicates that picture significantly because it represents a real physical pathway where a rupture doesn't necessarily stay contained to a single segment. And this isn't a purely theoretical possibility invented by a computer simulation. Geological records show that the San Andreas and San Jacinto faults have ruptured together at least 3 times over the past 2,000 years, with the most recent joint rupture occurring back in 1812. In other words, this is a documented historical pattern that has now finally been mapped with enough precision to understand exactly where and how it happens. If a rupture were to cross Kajan Pass today, it would turn what should have been a single fault earthquake into a joint multi-fault rupture, releasing far more energy at once. According to the study, a joint rupture crossing that junction could produce an earthquake somewhere between magnitude 7.4 and 7.8. That is not a localized event. A quake of that size would threaten the Los Angeles Basin, San Bernardino, Riverside County, and the Coachella Valley simultaneously. A USGS geologist who co-authored the study put it plainly, because it has been so long since either fault system experienced a major earthquake, the accumulated stress is enormous. That's really the entire reason this map changed. It isn't just that stress levels are historically high. It's that scientists now understand a specific mechanical pathway connecting two of the most dangerous faults in the country. A pathway that wasn't clearly modeled before this research came out. This story didn't stay buried inside an academic journal either. In early August, a Los Angeles news station aired a detailed segment on these findings, drawing on wider national reporting and featuring interviews with the lead researcher, as well as a well-known Caltech seismologist whose earthquake simulation work has been used for Southern California's own emergency planning for years. One detail from that coverage deserves more attention than it's gotten anywhere else: a warning about the region's water infrastructure. Aqueducts physically cross the San Andreas Fault, and if a major rupture happens, a significant number of people could be without water for an extended period. That's not a warning about buildings shaking or collapsing. That's a warning about basic survival infrastructure for millions of people sitting directly on top of one of the most stressed fault systems on the planet. A seismologist at USC who directs the statewide California Earthquake Center was asked directly when the next big event might actually happen. His answer was blunt. It could be today, tomorrow, in 10 years, or in 30 years. On a geological timescale, there genuinely is no meaningful difference between those options. It's worth pausing on just how densely populated the area sitting inside this risk zone actually is. The greater Los Angeles metropolitan area alone is home to more than 13 million people. San Bernardino and Riverside counties add several million more. The Coachella Valley, which includes the Palm Springs and Indio Resort Corridor, sees a constant stream of visitors layered on top of its permanent population, many of whom have no idea they're standing above one of the most closely studied fault junctions on the planet. A joint rupture crossing Cajun Pass wouldn't threaten just one city. It would simultaneously strain emergency services, hospitals, transportation networks, and water infrastructure across a region home to nearly 20 million people at once. To her credit, the lead researcher was careful about how she framed this, and her exact wording matters because it shapes how you should interpret everything else in this video. This is not a prediction of when an earthquake will happen, she said. However, studies like this are important contributions to national and global earthquake hazard research because they use rigorous, quantitative science to better understand the risk facing millions of people. What can be said is that the system is critically stressed, and physics-based models like this one give researchers a clearer picture of the range of scenarios that need to be prepared for. That's the honest scientific position, not a countdown clock, but a clear-eyed warning that the stress is real, historically unprecedented, and worth taking seriously. It's worth explaining briefly how a study like this actually gets built, because the methodology is what gives it real credibility, rather than it just being another alarming headline. The specific technique used here is called Coulomb stress modeling. It works by mathematically simulating how stress transfers through rock every time a section of a fault slips. Every past earthquake along a fault changes the stress on the segments around it, sometimes releasing pressure nearby, sometimes actually increasing it on a neighboring segment. By feeding centuries of documented slip history, radiocarbon dates, and geological survey data into a computer model, researchers can essentially reconstruct a 1,000-year timeline of how stress has been passed around section by section along the entire fault network. That's a fundamentally different approach from simply guessing based on how much time has passed since the last big earthquake. It's physics-based, it's testable, and it's openly published for other scientists to challenge, replicate, or refine. Exactly the kind of transparency that separates real seismology from speculation. There's a second piece of this story that most coverage has completely missed, and it represents another way California's earthquake map has genuinely shifted recently. Researchers identified an actively creeping section of the San Andreas Fault running directly through populated communities in the Bay Area. A creeping fault is one where the ground doesn't just sit locked in place waiting for a big rupture. It slowly, continuously slides, millimeter by millimeter, year after year. According to a study published through the Seismological Society of America, this creeping section is moving at roughly 3 millimeters a year. Here's the part that actually matters for the map itself. The actively slipping section isn't even in the location scientists previously believed it to be. Researchers traced a roughly 7-kilometer segment by examining more than 30 separate locations, with visibly displaced curbs and cracked sidewalks, physical on-the-ground evidence of the fault quietly shifting beneath people's streets. The Calaveras Fault, given its overall length, is considered capable of producing an earthquake of magnitude 6.7 or higher. With this updated understanding, the state's Geological Survey may formally designate this newly traced section as part of an official earthquake fault zone, a classification that directly affects real estate disclosures, construction requirements, and long-term city planning in that area. One geologist reacting to these findings put it simply, creeping faults might soften the size of a big earthquake by releasing some energy gradually, but that same creep causes continuous, quiet damage on its own, through shifted curbs and cracked pavement year after year, whether or not a major quake ever happens. Another researcher, familiar with the area, added an important caveat, noting that the original geological mapping likely missed this active strand entirely, because the underlying evidence for the original map location was never especially strong to begin with, and mapping faults accurately through dense urban development is genuinely difficult work. Unlike its better-known neighbor, the Hayward Fault, which still has meaningful stretches of open, undeveloped land along its length, the Calaveras Fault sits almost entirely underneath human infrastructure: roads, sidewalks, homes, and businesses. That means every millimeter of creep is quietly interacting with something people built, whether that's a curb, a foundation, or a water line, making this kind of updated mapping directly relevant to property owners and city planners right now, not just to geologists studying the distant future. Put these two stories together, the Cajun Pass earthquake gate and the newly traced Calaveras Fault strand, and you get the real headline behind all of this. California's earthquake map isn't a fixed, unchanging document. It's an active, evolving picture, and this year alone it has already shifted in 2 separate, scientifically significant ways. Now let's actually answer the question everyone came here for. Is the big one getting closer? The honest answer requires understanding what closer even means on a geological timescale. Stress accumulation is not a countdown timer with a number ticking down towards 0. It's closer to a slowly filling reservoir behind a dam, where nobody can tell you exactly which additional drop of water will be the one that finally breaks it. What this research tells us is that the reservoir, in this specific case, is fuller than it's been in 1,000 years of geological record. That doesn't mean an earthquake happens tomorrow. It means the window of years or decades during which a major rupture becomes statistically more likely has genuinely arrived, according to the best available physics-based modeling. To understand why an eventual major earthquake in California isn't automatically catastrophic, it helps to look at a very different country that just experienced something remarkably similar in scale. Earlier this year, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake struck off the Sanriku coast of northeastern Japan along the Japan Trench. Japan's own meteorological agency initially measured it even higher before settling on the final figure. The shaking was felt from Hokkaido in the north all the way down to central Japan, meaning tens of millions of people experienced it directly. Authorities issued a tsunami warning, and evacuation orders went out to tens of thousands of people in Hokkaido alone. Here's the final result of that entire event. Roughly 200 power outages, 2 people injured from falls, 0 deaths, 0 collapsed buildings, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake, tens of millions of people in the shaking zone, and the outcome was 2 minor injuries. That's not luck. Japan has invested for generations in strict seismic building codes, base isolation technology that acts like giant shock absorbers under buildings, train systems that automatically stop the instant sensors detect unusual movement, and a population trained from elementary school onward to respond to shaking almost automatically. California sits somewhere between Japan's level of preparation and far more vulnerable regions elsewhere in the world. The state has made real, measurable progress. Shake Alert, California's statewide earthquake early warning system, is now active and can give residents anywhere from a few seconds to tens of seconds of warning before major shaking arrives. That's genuinely significant, because 10 seconds is enough time to drop and take cover under a table, protecting yourself from the falling objects that cause most earthquake injuries. It's enough time for a surgeon to pause a procedure, for a high-speed train to begin emergency braking, or for an elevator to stop at the nearest floor and open its doors before anyone gets trapped inside. Here's how that system actually works, because it's genuinely elegant applied physics. When a fault ruptures, it generates 2 different kinds of seismic waves. P waves travel fast, but carry relatively little destructive energy. S waves travel slower, but carry the violent shaking that actually damages buildings and injures people. By detecting the P waves, the instant a rupture begins, and instantly transmitting an alert ahead of the slower, more dangerous S waves, Shake Alert can give populated areas that critical window of advance notice. That gap between detection and impact is small, but it's exactly the kind of margin that turns a chaotic emergency into a moment where people, hospitals, and transportation systems already know what's coming and can react before it hits. Building codes for new construction in California are genuinely strong, among the toughest in the country. But retrofitting older, more vulnerable buildings has been slow, and funding for earthquake preparedness in lower-income communities remains inconsistent across the state. That gap between what scientists now understand about the risk and what the general public and older infrastructure are actually prepared for is the real story sitting underneath every headline about this new map. It's also worth mentioning that California isn't the only place on Earth wrestling with this exact kind of long, quiet buildup of stress on a well-mapped fault. Istanbul, Turkey, home to over 16 million people, sits roughly 20 kilometers north of the North Anatolian Fault, one of the most active and well-studied strike-slip faults anywhere on the planet. The segment directly beneath the Sea of Marmara, just south of the city, hasn't ruptured since 1766, a span of over 250 years of continuously accumulating stress. Researchers estimate the probability of a magnitude 7.3 or higher earthquake striking beneath Istanbul within the next 30 years at around 47%. Essentially a coin flip. Southern California isn't uniquely stressed or uniquely doomed. It's one of several major, densely populated fault systems around the world currently facing the exact same underlying question. Not if, but when, and how prepared everyone will actually be when it happens. Let's talk about magnitude for a moment, because understanding this number properly changes how seriously you should take everything in this video. The scale used by the USGS is logarithmic, not linear. Each whole number increase represents roughly a 10-fold increase in shaking amplitude and about 31 times more energy released. A magnitude 7.5 earthquake doesn't release slightly more energy than a magnitude 6.5. It releases roughly 31 times more. A magnitude 8 releases about 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. That's why scientists get seriously concerned once numbers climb past 7, and it's exactly why a joint rupture in the magnitude 7.4 to 7.8 range, the exact range this new study is warning about, represents such an enormous release of stored energy. This is also why geologists never judge danger from magnitude alone. They look at depth, fault type, proximity to population centers, local soil conditions, and building quality. A magnitude 7.5 at 200 kilometers depth in an empty stretch of desert is a completely different event from the same magnitude at 10 kilometers depth directly beneath a major city. Same number, entirely different consequences on the ground. It's worth being direct here about what this study is not, because the wrong interpretation spreads fast online whenever a headline like this breaks. This is not a countdown to a specific date. This is not evidence that an earthquake is coming this week, this month, or even this specific year. Scientists still cannot predict exactly when any individual earthquake will strike, and nobody involved in this research has claimed otherwise. What has changed is our understanding of the underlying mechanics, the stress levels, and the pathways a rupture could take once it eventually happens. That's meaningfully different information, and it deserves to be treated with the same seriousness scientists are treating it with, not stretched into something scarier than what the data actually supports. So here's what you can actually do with this information starting today. You probably can't retrofit your own building overnight. Most people genuinely can't. But you can put together 72 hours of emergency supplies, water, food, first aid, flashlights, and any medications you rely on. You can find out exactly where your home's gas shutoff valve is located. You can strap your water heater to the wall and bolt down heavy furniture that could tip over during strong shaking. You can build a family communication plan for the moment mobile networks go down, because that exact failure has repeatedly made real earthquakes elsewhere far deadlier than they needed to be. You can download California's official Shake Alert powered early warning app, so you get those critical extra seconds of notice before shaking arrives. You can learn the evacuation routes out of your own neighborhood before you ever actually need them. None of these things take more than an afternoon to set up. In a major earthquake, they are frequently the actual difference between getting through the emergency safely and not getting through it at all. It's also worth having an actual physical plan for the specific moment shaking starts, not just a stocked supply closet. If you're indoors when strong shaking begins, the guidance from seismologists is consistent. Drop to the ground, take cover under sturdy furniture if it's available, and hold on until the shaking fully stops. If you're outdoors, move away from buildings, power lines, and anything that could realistically fall on you, and stay in that open space until you're confident the shaking has ended. If you're driving, pull over somewhere away from bridges, overpasses, and power lines, and stay inside your vehicle with your seatbelt on until it's safe to continue. These sound like simple instructions, and they are, but simple instructions rehearsed in advance are exactly what separated Japan's 2 minor injuries from far more serious outcomes seen elsewhere this year. If you already live in California, you probably already know some of this, but this new study is genuinely worth using as the reason to finally check the boxes you've been putting off. If you live somewhere else entirely, remember that Southern California isn't uniquely cursed here. It's simply one of the most studied, most monitored major fault systems on the planet, which is exactly why we're able to have this detailed conversation about it in the first place. One more layer worth understanding before we close is what actually happens to a modern city in the days and weeks after a major earthquake, not just during the shaking itself, because the shaking is really only the trigger. The disaster is everything that comes afterward. Immediate physical damage from a major rupture would be severe. Older, unreinforced buildings and soft story structures are the most vulnerable. Roads crack, bridges and overpasses get closed for inspection, and water systems that cross active faults are put directly at risk. That process of inspecting infrastructure and restoring services doesn't happen in hours. It happens over days. And in the case of major water and power infrastructure, sometimes weeks. Fires that ignite after an earthquake, when broken gas lines meet downed power lines, are historically among the most serious secondary hazards, because the water pressure needed to fight them is often exactly what's been compromised. Modern cities are deeply interdependent systems. Power, water, gas, communications, and transportation all rely on each other, and when a major earthquake disrupts all of them at once, restoring any single system depends on the status of the others. Emergency planners call this cascading failure, and it's the reason a major urban earthquake's true impact often unfolds over weeks or months rather than in the initial minute of shaking. None of this is meant to produce despair. Despair isn't useful here. Preparation is the entire reason scientists publish research like this in the first place. The reason hazard maps are made freely available to the public. The reason early warning systems get built, and the reason emergency planners run drills and publish preparedness guides. Communities that are genuinely prepared for major earthquakes consistently experience lower rates of injury and death than communities that aren't, even when the physical shaking itself is identical. Japan has demonstrated that repeatedly. Earthquake preparedness isn't a matter of luck. It's a choice, and it's one that's available to essentially everyone watching this video today. There's one more angle worth spending time on because it rarely gets mentioned alongside stories like this: the role of soil itself and how an earthquake actually feels on the surface. Not every neighborhood sitting above a fault experiences the same shaking, even during the exact same event. Areas built on soft, water-saturated soil, like reclaimed bay fill or old riverbed sediment, tend to amplify shaking dramatically compared to areas built on solid bedrock. This is part of why certain neighborhoods in past California earthquakes have suffered catastrophic damage, while nearby areas, just a few miles away and built on firmer ground, walked away with comparatively minor problems. In the worst cases, saturated, loose soil can undergo something called liquefaction, where the ground briefly behaves less like solid earth and more like a thick liquid, causing building foundations to sink, tilt, or fail entirely, even without any actual fault rupture directly beneath them. Understanding your own local soil conditions, information that's also publicly available through state hazard mapping tools, is just as important as understanding your distance from the nearest fault line, because two homes sitting the same distance from a fault can face wildly different risk levels depending entirely on what's underneath their foundations. This also explains why insurance and retrofitting conversations in California are so regionally specific rather than one size fits all. A soft-story apartment building sitting on liquefiable soil near a major fault represents a fundamentally different risk profile than a modern, code-compliant building sitting on solid rock several miles away from any mapped fault trace. Emergency planners and structural engineers increasingly talk about risk in these layered terms, combining fault proximity, expected magnitude, soil type, building age, and construction quality into a single picture, rather than relying on any single factor in isolation. That layered approach is exactly what this new research adds another piece to. It doesn't just tell us how much stress has accumulated, it tells us where a rupture could travel once it starts, which changes the entire calculation for the surrounding communities, their soil, and their buildings all at once. It's also worth remembering that earthquake science, unlike a lot of natural disaster prediction, genuinely gets better every single year. Every new borehole sample, every additional stretch of cracked sidewalk carefully surveyed, every improvement in supercomputing power that lets researchers run more detailed simulations adds another layer of precision to these hazard models. The study behind Cajun Pass wasn't possible with the tools and data available even a decade ago. That's not a reason to dismiss older research as wrong. It's a reminder that our understanding of these systems is still actively sharpening, and future updates to the same map are essentially guaranteed as more data comes in. That's a genuinely encouraging thing, even inside an otherwise sobering story, because it means the tools available to protect people against this risk are only going to keep improving from here. This planet has been building and releasing stress along fault lines for 4.5 billion years, long before any human being ever stood on its surface, and it will keep doing so long after every one of us is gone. We cannot stop earthquakes. We still don't have a reliable way to predict the exact day or hour the next major one will strike. What we can do, and what this new research actually hands us, is a clearer, more accurate map of where the risk is concentrated and how it might unfold once it finally does happen. The big one isn't a Hollywood concept anymore. According to the best available science published this year, it's a geological inevitability sitting on a fault system more stressed than at any point in the last 1,000 years, with a newly identified pathway that could make the eventual rupture larger than previously modeled. What happens when it finally arrives will depend enormously on decisions being made right now by city planners, engineers, policymakers, and ordinary residents alike. Exactly the way decades of preparation in Japan turned a magnitude 7.4 earthquake into 2 minor injuries instead of a catastrophe. We'll keep tracking this story as it develops. Every new stress measurement along the San Andreas, every update on the San Andreas Fault reclassification, every fresh study out of Cajon Pass. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it, because California's earthquake map is clearly not done changing. And before you go, drop a comment. Have you ever felt an earthquake? Or do you live somewhere close to a major fault line right now? Tell me where, because these numbers on a map represent real communities, real families, and real decisions that people are making right now based on exactly the kind of science we just walked through.